So President Trump is doubling down on taking Greenland and just imposed tariffs on 7 European nations after they voiced their support of Denmark and Greenland's sovereignty. Now, Russia is openly celebrating this unprecedented rift in the NATO alliance, and a Republican senator referred to this move as, quote, beyond stupid. Still, U.S. officials just today seem to be taking the stance, what is Europe even going to do about it? Guess we'll see. Now, President Trump posted to Truth Social yesterday that he would be charging a 10% tariff starting in February on goods from 8 European nations because of their opposition to American control of Greenland. He listed NATO allies, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland that would all face the tariff, and it would rise from 10 to 25% on June 1st if no deal was in place for the complete and total purchase of Greenland by the United States, saying, quote, the United States of America is immediately open to negotiation with Denmark and or any of these countries that have put so much at risk despite all that we have done for them. Now, a few keynotes here. First off, this caught Denmark off guard. The foreign minister Rasmussen said, quote, the president's statement comes as a surprise because earlier this week we had a constructive meeting with Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio. The purpose of the increased military presence in Greenland to which the president refers is to enhance security in the Arctic. Now, notably, the president seems to have moved a little bit away from using military force to take Greenland, although Secretary Besant here in a minute is going to, remind us that that is not actually off the table. When it comes to purchasing Greenland, Denmark opposes that, Greenland opposes that, and the American people oppose that. In fact, in a recent poll, only 13% of Americans supported the idea of buying Greenland. So there is very little to no support for even pursuing that course of action. And the way that it's going right now risks a major long-term divide in the NATO alliance. In fact, that question came up to kind of the administration person that faced these questions in the news today was Treasury Secretary Besant, and he was asked directly, is Greenland more important than NATO to U.S. national security?
So let me just put this to you bluntly. Is Greenland or NATO more essential to the United States national security?
Well, Chris, that's obviously a false choice. That's a
not
maximum.
from the perspective of European leaders.
The European leaders will come around and they will understand that they need to be under the U.S. security umbrella. What would happen in Ukraine that if the U.S. pulled its support out? The whole thing would collapse. That the U.S., Kristen, to be clear, since 1980, the U.S. has spent U.S. military spending versus NATO military spending. We have spent $22 trillion more dollars than the Europeans have. That we are peace through strength. And the Europeans now are only trying to play catch up. And that is only through President Trump. President Trump believes in NATO, but he does not believe in the American people being dragged in.
There's a lot to unpack there, to be fair. The whole idea that Europe will come around, it feels weird, like there's something going on here that we're just going to keep pushing and don't worry. They'll finally come to reality here at some point and give up this territory. The idea of the U.S. pulling support from Ukraine, I mean, we essentially have for about a year at this point, very, very minimal U.S. support to Ukraine. So I'm not sure that that's the best comparison for the secretary there, but we've got more from him here in a second. Turning to the European response, a joint statement was issued by all of the countries that now have tariffs on them or will have tariffs here in a couple weeks. They said the countries remain committed to strengthening Arctic security and are prepared to engage in dialogue grounded in respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Quote, tariff threats undermine transatlantic relationships and risk a dangerous downward spiral. We will continue to stand united and coordinated in our response. We are committed to upholding our sovereignty. Look, if we can pull a bit of positive news out of all of this, Europe is pretty united. I wish we could be united with them, and they weren't uniting because of stuff we were doing, talking about taking over territory. French President Emmanuel Macron said, quote, no intimidation or threat will influence us, neither in Ukraine nor in Greenland, nor anywhere else in the world where we are confronted with such situations. Tariff threats are unacceptable and have no place in this context. Europeans will respond in a united and coordinated manner should they be confirmed. We will ensure that European sovereignty is upheld. That comparison there, the United States into Greenland as Russia is into Ukraine has been made more than once now by our European allies. I want to try to stress how crazy it is that we're at this point, that they're looking at something that we're trying to do, saying, we didn't like it in Ukraine, we're not going to like it when you do the same thing. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, quote, applying tariffs on allies for pursuing the collective security of NATO allies is completely wrong. We, of course, will be pursuing this directly with the U.S. administration. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, said, quote, Starmer's U.S. policy lies in tatters. Trump is now punishing the UK and NATO allies for doing the right thing. It's time for the Prime Minister to stand firm against the bully in the White House and work with European and Commonwealth allies to make him back down from this reckless plan. As we're going through all this, I want you to keep back in mind this is a self-inflicted wound. There's no reason. We talked in a previous video, the national security debate seems to be the one that this administration is going with. It doesn't actually hold a lot of water. The recent national security strategy that was just released a few months ago doesn't mention Greenland. Like, if it is, it mentions the Arctic, doesn't mention Greenland. So if Greenland really genuinely is the most important thing in terms of U.S. national security to overshadow longstanding NATO alliances, it just popped up, like in the matter of the last couple weeks, or somehow didn't make it in to our critical national security documents. But that doesn't even hold water because Denmark and Greenland over and again have said, what do you want? Like, you can build more bases, you can put more troops, we can do more here. That request hasn't been made by the United States in over 20 years. So the national security aspect doesn't really hold water. Sweden's prime minister, so again, what's happening here, self-inflicted wound. The best argument, as awful as this sounds, the best argument that I've heard so far is that Trump wants Greenland, and it is not deeper than that. That actually lines up with the actions we're taking. Because again, the national security argument doesn't really hold water, that we would upset all. You want to talk about the Arctic? Like, yes, the United States is going to be contesting the Arctic with China and Russia. Have you looked at a map and seen what other countries have access to the Arctic? Quick hint, a bunch of them are NATO. They're great allies of ours. So are we really going to burn down that bridge to try? You see what I'm saying? It doesn't carry a lot of weight. Now, Sweden's Prime Minister Christensen said, quote, we will not let ourselves be blackmailed. That blackmailed term was brought up over and over again by European leaders in recent days. He says only Denmark and Greenland decide on issues concerning Denmark and Greenland. I will always stand up for my country and for our allied neighbors. This is an EU issue that affects many more countries than those now being singled out. Sweden is now having intensive discussions with other European Union countries, Norway and the United Kingdom, for a coordinated response. Denmark's prime minister said, quote, if the United States decides to militarily attack another NATO country, then everything would stop. That includes NATO and therefore second war security. And when you get into the use of military force here, I can understand the argument of course that's not going to happen. That's absurd. That's not really in the cards at all. But there's a couple notes here that I think are worth mentioning. Democratic Senator Chris Coons said, quote, when the most powerful military nation on earth threatens your territory through its president over and over again, you start to take it seriously. Yes. Look, let's be honest. If we were hearing this type of language from China or Russia, we would be assuming that they are planning on using military force. It is ridiculous. I don't think it should be in the cards at all, but seemingly it is. In fact, let's jump to that clip here real quick. Scott Bessent was asked again, this seemingly is against the will of the people of Greenland and Denmark, taking it, or buying it, let alone military force. And they ask, how is this different if we do so than, Russia taking over Crimea?
As far as I have heard, has not taken military force off the table. If the United States were to take Greenland by force, how would that be different than Russia's annexation of Crimea?
Look, I believe that the Europeans will understand that this is best for Greenland, best for Europe, and best for the United States.
So, but military action is still on the table?
I haven't spoken with the president on that. And again, I believe that the Europeans will understand that the best outcome is for the U.S. to maintain or receive control of Greenland.
That was a tough clip to watch, but how about this for an easy answer? When an administration official is asked, are we actually going to be using military force against some of our closest allies around the world? Here's one. I'll just, we can write this down and send this over to the administration. How about this? Yeah, of course, military action's off the table. These are some of our closest allies, and I'm sure we'll find some sort of workable solution here. Why are we not taking military action off the table with our NATO partners? That is ridiculous. It is absurd that conversation is even happening. The EU representative for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, said, quote, China and Russia must be having a field day. They are the ones who benefit from divisions among allies. If Greenland's security is at risk, we can address this inside of NATO. Tariffs risk making Europe and the United States poorer and undermine our shared prosperity. We also cannot let our dispute distract us from our core task of helping end Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, Russia is openly celebrating this. Like, they cannot believe what they're seeing. Dmitry Medvedev said, quote, the U.S. is preparing to attack Greenland, choosing the island itself rather than some kind of Atlantic solidarity. The impudent Europeans will be punished with tariffs for their defense within NATO. And then Kirill Dmitriev, who is running part of the negotiations with Steve Witkoff and the others on Trump's team there, he's the Russian representative, called this the collapse of the transatlantic union. Genuinely, they can't believe how lucky they are that this is just happening. They're just sitting there, and we're just dismantling NATO on our own. Now, one aspect that we haven't really delved into is how about the people of Greenland? All right, there have been pretty significant protests in that country in recent days. From what I can tell, we've got 13% of Americans that are on board with buying Greenland. I'm not sure that it's even to that point in Greenland wanting to be a part of the United States. But either way, here's a quick clip showing some of those protests and talking with citizens of Greenland about how they feel about this.
It's very clear that we want our own country for ourselves, and we won't receive anything from Trump no matter what.
We have always welcomed collaboration with the outside world and with the U.S., and now we are talked about being occupied or bought. It is unacceptable, and it affects the people of Greenland. As you can see today, it has a lot of resonance with them. They want to show their disgust with this.
Now, in terms of pushback here in the United States, we're getting a little bit. Republican Senator Thom Tillis, again, all of this is coming out on the weekend, so I would expect we're going to hear more from our lawmakers come Tuesday, I guess, when the work week begins after the long weekend. Republican Senator Thom Tillis pretty quickly jumped on it, though, saying, quote, this response to our own allies for sending a small number of troops to Greenland for training is bad for America, bad for American businesses, and bad for America's allies. It's great for Putin, Xi, and other adversaries who want to see NATO divided. The fact that a small handful of advisors are actively pushing for coercive action to seize territory of an ally is beyond stupid. And I think The Economist did a good job in an article yesterday talking about exactly what's at stake here and how bad this is. They have an article I'll have linked below titled, America's Hunger for Greenland is Tearing NATO Apart. Trump could gain an island and lose a continent. They say, quote, if America were to absorb Greenland, either by legal fait accompli or force, the resulting crisis would collapse European trust in Article 5, the alliance's mutual defense clause. Mr. Trump has frequently cast doubt on it. European faith now hangs by a thread. If he were willing to dismember one European country, why would he come to the aid of another being dismembered by Russia? Seems pretty valid to me. They say European governments would then face a stark choice. Some would argue that Greenland is too small and unimportant to warrant collapsing transatlantic ties. Others would be concerned that a rupture could prompt Russia to attack or at least probe European defenses. They do say there is an option here for Europe to push back. Europeans could, they say, for instance, resort to economic punishment through sanctions and tariffs. Again, just to register where we are, we're talking about the U.S. and the European Union getting into a trade war over ownership of Greenland. What's happening here, guys? What are we doing? Have we really pursued all means to ensure Arctic security by working with our Danish and our Danish partners and our partners in Greenland? You sure? Because I feel like that conversation hasn't really been had at all. In fact, the Danes are saying, what's going on? We were talking about this. Why are we taking all of a sudden these aggressive measures? It is self-inflicted gunshot wounds here, and it's hard to understand why. It is Again, this is one of those things where you can say it's just a negotiating tactic. This is what Trump does, and I would argue that it's a bad negotiating tactic. Because even if everything works out perfectly well a week, 2 weeks, a month from now, look at what position we're putting our allies into, wondering if we'll actually stand by them against Russia, having Russia look at actions taken by the United States going, this is great. NATO isn't what we thought it was. The U.S. is not going to stand with their allies, and the allies are not going to stand with the United States if it continues down this route, which I think is something that is underappreciated. A lot of the voices I'm hearing here about, we'll take Greenland, kind of the idea that Scott Bessent presents there of what is Europe even going to do about it? They're going to come around. Don't worry. We got this. The idea that everyone around the world is fully dependent on the United States and there's no reciprocity there at all. Now, yes, the United States provides the majority of firepower when it comes to NATO, and we do provide a security blanket to a number of countries all around the world. No doubt. There's no debating that. But we also receive a lot of intelligence from allies abroad. We're able to base out of their countries, so we actually have the ability to reach far-off lands to conduct security operations or carry out strikes against terrorist leaders. If we just shut all of that off, the U.S. military loses a significant amount of our capabilities. We are who we are today alongside our allies. When we close that door, the U.S. military does not look capability-wise like it did the day prior. Now, it's impossible to put a percentage on that. Are we 10% less effective, 40% less effective? But we should know that. Like, if we just decide to shut off all these allies and they no longer want to work with the United States because we're not viewed as a trustworthy ally, or they don't want us in their country basing out of ports and airfields, that will have a direct, immediate impact on our ability to defend ourselves. Alliances can be messy. Was it Winston Churchill once said the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them? It's never going to be perfect. This isn't perfect. It's embarrassing that we're in this situation and frustrating that it seems like we keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. In terms of what to watch for going forward, a little bit of optimism. We should see some sort of European response. It sounds like a bunch of foreign ministers are meeting here in the next couple days, talking about what they're going to do in response to this. And then again, U.S. lawmakers should be back here in a couple days, taking the weekend off, watching some football. I don't know, but maybe we will actually get some pressure. I mean, what this looks like is that the president decided by himself to layer tariffs on some of our closest historical allies because he wants Greenland. I'm having a hard time hearing an argument that fits this situation better than that. And that's not how we should be conducting foreign policy. That's not how we should be setting up the future for the United States or our allies abroad. So hopefully we get some lawmakers back in next week that find some way to, for once, maybe ever, actually push back on this for, again, as Till has said, the good of the American people, the good of American businesses, and the good of America's allies. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.